You're on.
Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to our discussion in the book of First Corinthians. In our last discussion, we closed out the 6th chapter and are beginning our discussion in chapter 7. My name is Johnny Oxendine, and the others who are part of this discussion today, Sonny Leong, Brother Brian in the UK in London, and Brother Michael Hatcher. That we would like to discuss this afternoon are 1 Corinthians chapter 7, probably going verses 1 through 9. I'll read those verses and then we'll come back and take a look at them. We hope that you will watch or perhaps join the discussion itself if it's available to you. You can find it, of course, on YouTube under Michael Hatcher 52. Now, concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power over of her own body, but the husband, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after his manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Looking at these passages, one of obvious from the beginning that Paul is now beginning to address. There are now things to deal with as you look at that in the Greek. Let us now pass on to the question that you asked me in the less obvious, that the Corinthian brethren had some things that they were inquiring about with the apostle. This, of course, is one of those things. One might also say, now I'm going to speak to you about the manners that you wrote to me about. So they have asked Paul a question regarding this subject. When we think back to the book of Genesis, in the book of Genesis, God said it is not good for man to be alone. But here we see that Paul, possibly in a quote or restatement from the earlier letter from the Corinthians, is saying something that could give the impression of someone, not necessarily so, but could give the impression that he is agreeing with them that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, which of course refers to sexual relations. But he says to avoid fornication or to avoid immorality, let each one have his own spouse. When we begin to look at this and ask the question that is before us, concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, good for a man not to touch a woman. Michael, in your studies of this passage, what have been some of the things that people have been saying that may have led the Corinthians to this particular point of view? We know that in some cases that there are some that are saying that in Corinth they were claiming that spiritual priorities took precedence over the physical intimacy that one was going to have with one's spouse. That maybe that was a ruse. Have you ever heard of it addressed that way?
I've heard it addressed more from the standpoint of the fornication that they argued in chapter 6, that the body was created for fornicate or for sexual contact. Thus, it's just normal if you go out and fornicate of course, with the Temple of Diana, there it gave credence to that view that there's all of these 1,000 prostitutes going down into the city to worship by their sexual conduct. And so I've usually heard it approached from that standpoint.
Okay. Sonny, what about you?
Sorry, I can't hear you. You got cut off for a while.
I said, what ways have you?
Sorry, Johnny.
Or to the Corinthians.
It's cutting off.
Michael,
I missed
could you
the other half
transmit
of the
that
question.
Yeah, Sonny, he was talking about that phrase, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, and the ways in which you've heard it presented as to the meaning of that.
So far, I've not come across any arguments on that. No, sorry.
Oh, I was looking at it also from the historical, just the historical, in the historical context. Why would the Corinthians be writing Paul with regard to this particular issue? Here he says, however, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let each man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. You know, in a very hypocritical way, claiming that these spiritual priorities that they were seemingly giving to themselves gave them the right to no longer engage in sexual relations with their wives, but would allow them, as Michael was saying earlier, to engage in sexual activities with prostitutes. And here we see a situation where he's obviously addressing this, or addressing this at least from some vantage point, where, as he says here, let the husband render due benevolence to the wife, and also the wife to the husband. There is obviously a situation in Corinth where to them on this idea that a man and a wife, for some reason, would not be engaging in the marital relations and intimacy. Paul begins, he looks at this, and he explains that, as he says in verse 3, there's an obligation of one pleasing one's spouse. And there, of course, when he speaks in verse 3, let the husband render unto the wife, the verb that is used there is in the present imperative, which really indicates what should be in a habitual duty, and stresses the importance of providing rather than what one is receiving. Is this something that we don't talk about much in the church these days, Michael? Have you ever had to counsel in this particular area? It would seem for some a very uncomfortable.
It's not something that is talked about often.
God knows.
And one that something that goes along with that would be the Book of Song of Solomon, and it expressing the beauty of married love. Have you ever heard anyone teaching the Book of Song of Solomon? I don't know of a case where that has taken place.
Well,
so,
we've taught it in San Mateo because it's one of the books of the Bible. I don't know any reason to avoid something that the Bible teaches. I think that we have to be informed on all matters of life, all things pertaining to life and godliness. And whether it's in a counseling session with newlyweds, or a counseling session with people who may be having issues or problems. But I don't see that there's anything wrong with it even being addressed from the pulpit, from the standpoint of people need to understand that God does. There are no issues in life that God does not address and does not inform us on, and especially with regard to responsibility in this particular area.
I think part of the problem with the teaching of it is dealing with it in a way that is you don't get into using gutter language and trying to approach it from the standpoint of the dignity that it deserves, and yet the language that people use in dealing with sexual matters generally is not the best. And so there is a problem in just trying to communicate in relationship to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as he discusses this, of course, the idea behind what may have been one of the problems there in Corinth, the way that Paul uses that term, defraud ye not one the other, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, come again together, that Satan not tempt you in this situation. The very real possibility that if someone in their marriage decides that they are no longer going to have relations with their spouse, it provides a fertile ground of temptation for Satan. I think that when we look at you mentioned the Song of Solomon, but also I think when you look at the book of Proverbs, I think the book of Proverbs uses that very strong, not only the perhaps metaphor of the power of sin being compared with the urge or the interest in sexual matters. I think that in the book of Proverbs, or the woman in the street tempting, and I think that when we look at those verses, we can see that there the idea of sex as a strong and alluring subject is metaphorically used as well for the temptation of sin itself. Sin itself, the way that Satan is always attempting to use it. Look at our society, everything in society now, so many things in society are so openly about this particular subject, not so much the subject of the marital relations, but just free and open sexual relationships, fornication, as you mentioned it. This is the kind of thing that when we look here, Paul says that in the marital relationship, and we can just be simple in moving on through this, make sure that you do not refuse what is due the other person. This to prevent either and both of you from falling into the temptation of sin.
According to some tradition, that actually in the marriage contract of certain nations, there was a provision set forth as to how many times a man would have to have sex with his wife per week. And if he did not live up to that, then he was not fulfilling his duty and his contract in that marriage relationship. So it's an important part of our existence.
It is. It's an important part of our existence. It's an important part of and from the standpoint of the scriptures. The Lord, of course, we think about the marital unit and the responsibility that we have to one another. And the example in that was faithfulness itself is aligned with one's faithfulness to God. And I think that there's that aspect of it as well. If we are not going to be faithful to our spouse, if we're not going to provide for our spouse that due benevolence, I think we can also look at that from a spiritual standpoint. What would a person's relationship to God be? Do we hold back things from the Lord? Do we not give Him what is due? We could look at a number of back in the book of Malachi. I mean, a lot of places where we can see that those who are being addressed were not providing God with their best, or not giving God what they were supposed to give. So I look at that not only as we see the historical narrative, the historical context of it, but how it is consistent with so many other aspects of the life that is expected of child to God. Our relationship to God is very similar to, in some ways, very similar to the relationship that we should have with our spouse with regard to faithfulness, with regard to duty, with regard to love, as we see a man loves his wife as Christ loved the church. So I think that in those ways we can see a certain consistency there. When we look at verse 7, and he says, I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, and one after this manner and another. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Is that the reason for a person to get married? Brian?
Sorry, I'm just actually reading the scripture, focusing on that. What was your question?
Is that the reason for a person to get married?
What it would appear to be. That's clearly the scripture saying that a person cannot control their sexuality. I mean, it's a crucial part of the God's approval. But if we can't do that, well, for the man that has a girlfriend, to marry would seem to be the reasonable thing to do.
That brings up a question. I wanted to put it out here for the panel. They're putting this out here for the discussion itself. There have been some who have said that until or unless a person is really ready or seriously interested involved in dating at all. Any thoughts on that? We'll start with you, Brian. If a person is not going to get married, then why would one engage in dating?
Inexperience, wanting to experience, wanting to find the truth about things that, or the reality about male and female relationships, the difficulties and problems and so on, the attractiveness of and beauty of women, which is really quite astonishing, but they're certainly attractive to the eyes. But I think that the problem is you can't really expect a young person to make a decision to become a eunuch for Christ. I mean, that would be the ideal situation, to become a eunuch for Christ. when entirely normal. And in certain situations, I would say that's fair enough. If, for example, determined to forsake homosexuality and not practice it as his sexual preference, well, that would be an admirable controlling thing for him to do. Whether or not people of a certain age, up to a certain age, are able to exercise such self, it takes years to recognize the need for self-control and to do what is right and not what is wrong. We all take our time coming to these things.
Well, Paul does say, going back to verse 2, to avoid fornication, to make sure that you don't put yourself in a situation where you can be tempted, to make sure that you don't put yourself in a situation where you can easily make, in order to avoid all of those areas of temptation, then let one have his own wife. When we go back, all the way back to the book of Genesis, we see that God said it is good for man not to be alone. God recognizes that it is better for us not to be alone, that the wife would be the helpmeet, that it is the not only from the physical standpoint, but also the spiritual standpoint, having a person who is helped stay on the path of righteousness. A person can look objectively at you and even at times when necessary be critical of us, make sure that we're trying to do the right thing. God recognizes that could be an admirable trait, but God does know his creation perhaps better than we might in some instances know ourselves. We're always capable of a certain self-delusion and the idea that we can justify our actions. This is also something Paul was addressing with the Corinthians. We go back to chapter 6. But he says, in order to avoid these temptations, this very specific temptation. And the book of 1 Corinthians does deal quite a bit with immorality, sexual immorality. And Paul goes back here, let every man have his own wife. Let every woman have her own husband. But when you do that, do not neglect them. You can't, as it says here, the wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. And the husband has not power of his own body, but the wife. So the two become one. And in this relationship, there is not a refusal or defrauding one, except there be that we not be tempted by Satan. He says he wishes that that all men were as he. And he says to the unmarried, it is good for them if they abide, even as he. But if this is not possible, and in most cases, in most instances, and perhaps nearly all instances, this is not the likelihood that we're going to find. A person should to a question. If a person has no intention of marrying, then why would a person engage in date? I mean, what does one gain from the date?
Companionship, friendship.
But would that be possible in any long term without temptation?
No. Straight up, no. Unfortunately, temptations will come, and we have to seek to overcome them by recognizing when we've fallen, what we need to do to recover, to repent. The Christian life is one of self-control, and that self-control that we're required to have takes time. We don't get it overnight. It takes years of self-discipline, of, as it were, failing to do what we should have done, repenting of it and going on. So,
well, what I'm also pointing at is in verse 9, Paul is not saying, Paul is not saying to a person that this is the frame of mind that they would have. Well, I just can't help myself.
in these matters.
I can't help myself, so I'm going to go out and find a wife. I don't think that's really the idea that's behind it in most instances. The person goes out to find a wife just to take care of desires. Michael, you're going to come in?
There was some interesting comments by Marvin Vincent along this line and regarding this. He says that marriage was regarded as a duty among the Jews, so that a man was considered to have sinned if he had reached the age of 20 without marrying. The Mishnah fixed the age of marriage at 17 or 18, and the Babylonish Jews as early as 14. A rabbinical precept declared that a Jew who has no wife is not a man. Now, that gives a little bit different perspective if that's the thinking of those people of that day in relationship to what Paul is saying here.
Well, the idea of it being expected, I don't think it's. I think only now in certain countries is it seen. I'd be now even in the United States and some other places, for a person to not marry is not seen as unusual. I think that in most every culture there's the expectation that a person will grow up and get married and have children and raise a family, and that their family would do likewise. I think that's been something that's been expected from the very beginning. From the very beginning, we see how God looked at the family. Only now in our culture do we see, so many people not marrying, and along with that, the idea of people divorcing at such a high rate. I'll use an example.
This goes a little bit beyond what the normal thinking is along that line. Is the point that I was making, that if a man isn't married by 20, he's sinned. And if a man doesn't have a wife,
that was a tradition? Was that a tradition, or was that a?
It was just traditional. That from the standpoint, that's what they considered it as. And then also, as this rabbi said, a Jew who doesn't have a wife is not a man. We didn't consider it that, even though it's expected, yes, but we don't. I don't know of many cultures who go to that extreme, is what I'm saying. And then Paul is fighting, apparently, at least partially, that type of thinking in this. So it just gives an added thought in relationship to what he's writing about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And many of those cases, and if I recall, you can correct me if I have this incorrect, those were family arranged marriages in the case of the Jews. Is that not correct?
That would be correct. Most of them, if not all, marriages at that time were family related or arranged.
Family arranged. This, of course, is not the same thing, but I was looking at recently. They were talking about how in the United States, I don't know about in the UK, but how in the United States now more and more people longer before they even buy a home, if they even buy a home, where it used to be that a person was pretty much expected to try to get a home. nowadays the not teenagers, but the 20s and 30s were deciding not to do that with the same frequency. So just from that standpoint of how things change in cultures. But here with the Corinthians, how would you like to be serving in that congregation there, Sonny? How would you like to be serving as one of the elders in that congregation?
Sorry, the line is very bad. I could hardly hear much of it. So I'm sticking my ears close to the screen. Sorry.
Michael, could you transmit that question of mine to him?
What would it be like to be an elder in the congregation at Corinth?
I think the elder is going to have a tough time. From what I've seen, I was thinking, that Johnny, that in chapter 7, verse 1, he says that concerning the things which you wrote to me, it is not good for a man to touch a woman. But then I think that going back to what Paul said earlier, concerning the brother, the guy who slept with his stepmother, in verse 9 of 1 Corinthians 5, he said, I wrote to you. That's right, 5:9. He said that I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. So it seems to suggest to me that they might have misread or misunderstood what Paul was trying to say, because he went on. He says that yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world. It seems that that they seem to have misread the message, thinking that in that case that we got to cut ourselves off from everyone, and hence that their response to that epistle was that, well, in that case, then since that we shouldn't be associated with anyone who is sexually immoral or anyone else for that matter, that is good for a man not to touch a woman. So as they celebrate, as what the Buddhist monks are doing. And then Paul says, no, you're wrong. No, that's not what I was trying to say. And this is what I'm saying here. This is what I meant. That nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife. So that there is a balance to be struck in the kingdom of God. That if you are married, then you have certain duties towards your spouse, and likewise vice versa. And that for those who are unmarried and widows, there is a balance as well. If you can be like me, good. If you can't, then you may need to consider marrying. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. So I think that it seems to suggest that was the thinking, that the misunderstanding of what had been written before to them, and hence that response. And this is Paul's reply to it.
I think that's right. And we're looking back here when he says this. I think he is making a response to what they had written, and I'm looking at this as though he is using the wording that they perhaps had used in their writing to him. The things that you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, but in a particular context, he's using this. Nevertheless, let every man have his own wife, and that, of course, may very well be a slide effort by Paul readdressing the situation in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Let every woman have her own husband, and there, of course, with respect to the situation, but it does look like they could have misread some of what Paul had said to them, and of course, that their own views were pretty liberal, very liberal, on the matter of fornication, on the matter of morality. And Paul seems to constantly have to bring their attention back to this. He constantly has to shape the argument for them. When you go, as a matter of fact, you go back to chapter 6, when you leave those verses that the earlier parts of that chapter, and he begins to talk about the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord. Know ye not the bodies are the members of Christ, and there, of course, with regard to being like the temple, there was obviously a problem in Corinth with, and this even after Paul had been there for quite some time. they were still driven by this sexual misapplication, in instances where they were absorbing themselves or allowing themselves to be absorbed into the general culture. And again, therein is the problem that we see, not just in this particular instance, but even today the church finds itself often subject to the culture, cultural influence. How many people do we hear who today are under the impression that civil government trumps whatever the Bible teaches on divorce and remarriage? I mean, that is a situation where we've heard of people who they're divorced for whatever reasons. Or there again, we see, what is it about the Corinthians? What is it about people today where we give more credence to the civil authorities than to the scriptures? What is that? Or what is the reasoning behind that? Paul, are you able to comment at this time? If not, Brian will ask you to take that question.
Well, simply, the Bible is to those without, who don't have the knowledge and understanding of what God says in His Word and why. It's alien. It's hostile to their lifestyle and their beliefs and their inclinations and their thinking. So inevitably, there is this, the ignorance that is abroad in the world, which is widespread, common, and massive, as to what God approves and why. God wants people to live holy lives, as God is perfect, so He desires that Christians also aspire to perfection, to be holy as God is. People don't want that aspiration. They want to do what they want to do because they want to do it. So you have basically, I'm afraid, the sinful world, the sinful inclinations of people that run counter and hostile to the gospel, and that's why people would seemingly not be open to the gospel as they ought to be.
But I wonder, why would people in the church, as we look at the Corinthians, why would people in the church be so much more willing to allow the influence of the world, the influence of civil government, the influence of in some instances, denominational religious people, to have greater influence over us than the scriptures themselves? There has to be some psychology behind this, whereby a person says, well, everyone else is doing it. The Corinthians seem to be this mindset. Everyone else is doing it. Why can't we be, this perhaps maybe you want to go back to the discussion of God's people and during the time of Samuel, where they wanted to be like the nations. What is this urge behind being like everyone else? Do we not appreciate the distinctive nature of the Christian? Do we not understand and appreciate what it means to be pilgrims and strangers? Is this such a difficulty for us?
Johnny.
Go ahead.
I have personally encountered the other extreme of it, where brethren in the church, who would undergo a church wedding, okay, without registering the union which the law requires, and yet consider themselves married in the eyes of God.
Why would they do that?
I confronted the pair before, and the answer to me is that, as far as we are concerned, God will honor our decision to marry before in a church wedding, and we are married regardless of what the law says. That's the other extreme.
that is an extreme, and they're not recognizing that by registering that there is nothing that is that registration impinging on their Christian faith.
Yeah, you know that I say to the couple that you're committing fornication, and certainly they were not happy with that. As you know, that they wouldn't be happy with that. And I explained the reason why. I say that if you go out into the world and you tell them we are married, and that if the authorities require to produce proof of your marriage, and you ain't got the marriage certificate, how are you going to say it? You know, so you are no different. I say you're no different from those who are living together.
Part of marriage.
They were not happy, of course.
And what
The
about the
parents
children?
were not happy with me.
Part
about
of
the
the
children as well?
marrying process is obeying the laws of the land.
Yes, that's why. You see, and I was taken aback that it was a Church of Christ minister who actually carried out the ceremony.
Wow.
Not another Singaporean.
No, not there. No,
No.
it's in the U.S.
That is a very odd approach by which one may avoid every law.
Yes, I was rebuked for highlighting that. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard of that one. But that would be another extreme on the other end. That I'm just married. But you know what? You approached it from the right angle because anyone could say that.
Yeah.
Anyone could say that and live together. Well, we're married. We're married in the eyes of God, and may not even do that without having a ceremony.
Yeah. That's right. That's why I say it. You see that it's no different from those people who live together and say, well, who cares about what the law says? As far as I'm concerned, we're married. We're husband and wife.
Well,
you know.
What if one of them said it and the other one didn't?
The sad thing is that both of them say the same thing. You see.
Well, yeah, in that case, but
that will happen sooner or later. That will happen sooner or later.
I say I'm married to this person, and they say that they're not. Then which one is it?
Yeah, I know.
Is it half of them?
Yeah, that's the hypothetical. Yeah. That was.
And the sad thing is basically that they told the church that they were married, whilst they were not married.
Oh, there. Of course, you do that. That's the dichotomy with that situation, and so they were upset with you for pointing it out.
Yeah, they were upset. Yeah, I mean, I say to them that if you say to the church that you just got married, and how do you understand it? The husband said to me that, as far as I'm concerned, when I say that I meant that I'm married in the eyes of God. So I said to him that, but you didn't specify that when you announced it to the church, did you? You know, the understanding is that when I say that I'm married, it means if people to say that, do you have a marriage contract to prove it? I will tell you yes. But I say that if I ask you, do you have a marriage contract to prove it? You have to say no, because you're not married. But you say, I don't care, but God recognized the marriage. You know.
Oh,
so
that's like those. It's like those who have made the claim. I've heard this before that they don't really, and this of course was a little bit more kooky. But they didn't really need to attend worship services because God.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. You break out the last bit.
I said there have been those who have said that they don't attend worship services because God talks to them directly.
Well, I mean, I have heard of cases that recently I was talking to a sister as well, who hasn't been attending, and she said that I'm doing home worship. Home worship is as good as church worship. I said to her that if home worship is as good as church worship, then why is the point of having the church in the New Testament? And she never answered me. Yeah.
That also brings in, though, what Sonny was saying in that situation, the common law marriage.
Yeah.
Which a number of states in the U.S. do accept.
Yeah,
Do they?
that's true. But that would mean that they have to commit fornication for how many years before the state accepts it as marriage?
Yeah, it's very sad anyway. I got told off for rebuking them.
Well, happy that
I know of a case, though, that the actual marriage license was never submitted by the preacher to the state after the marriage ceremony, and so years and years after the marriage, this couple came to find out that it had never been sent in. So you have all sorts of different things that will come up.
Now, in such a case as that, would you condemn them? They had gone through the actions that they thought were required.
Well, they went through every action that was required. The preacher didn't do his job in sending in the license after the ceremony.
Well,
it wasn't their fault.
You would think at some point they would have asked for their marriage license.
I'm not sure that a lot of people even know that it's sent back to you when they get married. I think a lot of people just think it to the state, and then the state keeps it.
It keeps it on file. I see.
It keeps it on file. But that's some of the things you get into, though. But no, I would not condemn them any at all.
People, when it comes to so many matters that have to do with the Bible and the church, the way people respond is the complete opposite of the way that they would respond to anything else in this world.
Yeah.
If someone brought you a check and you were going to pay with a credit card, and they just took your credit card and then brought your credit card back, but never brought the receipt, I wonder how many people would just walk out and say, well, okay, wouldn't most people want their receipt if they charge something on a credit card?
I know of a lot that don't care if they get the receipt or not.
No, but at least they see the receipt.
They at least see that there is a charge and everything, but
it's amazing.
Yes, it is.
Anyway, let's next week we want to continue and really beginning with verse 10, where Paul talks about his, as he says, and unto the married I command, yet not. Look at that very first verse there. Dissect it a little bit. What does Paul mean? Let not the wife depart from the husband. We want to look at that because this is also not the first portion of that, but let not the wife depart from the husband. If she depart, let her remain unmarried. Those parts of the verses. Still very often misunderstood and controversial in the United States. I don't know about in the UK. But let's take a very close look, somewhat hermeneutical look at these verses this week. So we want to thank you for being with us this afternoon. We hope that in looking at this, if we've learned anything, it is, of course, that the husband and wife have a responsibility to one another. That is an ordained responsibility. That it is not one in which they can defraud the other or refuse from the other. That we are, in fact, if married, one flesh. That God intended for man to be with a wife is not good for man to be alone. This, of course, found in the book of Genesis. If we can learn anything from the verses that we have read, this afternoon. Let's understand those things. And of course, the general misunderstanding that may have occurred with the Corinthians as a result of their own worldly minded they were having with carnality, the circumstances that were the background for this conversation coming up from at least chapters 5, 6, and 7, and try to continue to, as we teach in our own congregations, see what the Bible says, preach it the way that it speaks, and continue to try to abide in the word of the Lord to the very best of our abilities. We want to thank you for being with us this afternoon and this evening, of course, in the UK. We're going to sign off now. Goodbye.